Okay. Good evening. It's been a little while since since we've done a live stream. A lot has happened. A lot has happened. The Women's Rugby World Cup has now started. We've now completed the pool stages, so we know who's going through to the knockout stages, and I'll do a preview on the quarterfinals at some point next week. It looks really interesting. Finally, New Zealand, the Black Ferns, have turned up and put in an 80-minute performance where they were much the better side over Ireland and thumped them down in Brighton 40 points to nil, which is, a statement win from the Black Ferns. So that's really interesting. We've obviously now entered the first international break in European football, global football so early into the season, and a lot of people are already frustrated that we've already got an international break when the season's only a couple of weeks old. On top of that, Bayer Leverkusen obviously has sacked Eric Ten Hag after just 3 regular season games. And it's very interesting what's come out about the Eric Ten Hag sacking in regards to how players dealt with him, his coaching staff dealt with him, how the club dealt with him, his views on the transfer policy, who he wanted to sign, who he didn't want to sign, and those issues there. And a lot of people were really surprised that the sacking happened, but more and more reports have been coming out of Leverkusen in Germany in regards to his sacking and the reasoning that the Leverkusen board decided to take the action they did and remove him from his post. Now they've got this international break to find a replacement. There's going to be a lot more managerial sackings before this season is done. And I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to have some major managerial sackings at some big clubs in England and Scotland before Christmas. There's a lot of clubs where I think we're going to see managerial change. Good evening, good evening, good evening. How is Wales treating you? It's been quite a pleasant day here. Quite a pleasant day here, if I'm being honest. Oh, gotta love a cup of tea in the evening. Gotta love a cup of tea. It's not rained here today. There was a chance of rain earlier. You can feel the damp in the air. I mean, the weather has started to change. Which last weekend and for periods this week, the weather's been a bit grotty and last week. But where I am, the weather isn't too bad. I mean, look, I'm kind of glad the summer's over, if I'm being honest. It's been a long summer. I think, and I'm feeling the effects of this summer. I really am. I think this summer's taken it out of me physically, I can tell you that. And I've been struggling with a bit of a chesty cough for most of the summer. And I do think it's down to the weather's had an impact. A lot of money about Tuchel. I didn't watch the Andorra game, but I will be watching the qualifier on Tuesday. And I haven't actually watched any of the Tuchel internationals so far, since he's been appointed over the last year. But I will watch the qualifier on Tuesday, and then I can pass judgment on the style of play. Look, it's qualifiers, it's friendlies, it's qualifiers. I'm not overly concerned. I don't watch the qualifiers as religiously as I used to. If I'm being honest, I don't think Tuchel's a bad manager. I don't. But look, the Andorra game, I mean, look, the fans were singing, Keir Starmer's a wanker. So it just shows how entertaining the game was. To only win 2-0 is also embarrassing as well. And look, I don't get political, but when the fans are, basically slagging off the current Prime Minister, who I may add is not my favourite cup of tea, who says having a cup of tea, that's neither here nor there, but it does sum up the quality of the match. I didn't watch the match. I watched a couple of the Women's Rugby World Cup matches yesterday. I couldn't watch them all because I don't get the timings with the Women's Rugby World Cup. So the first weekend, you had about a half hour, 45-minute gap between matches, and I could do all the match reviews, watch all the games, not miss a single minute. Last weekend and this weekend, I've been able basically to watch 3 out of the 4 games per day, and not even all the games in full. And I'm thinking, whoever's done the TV timings, um, I don't know. I mean, really, that's frustrating. It's they could do those TV timings better. I think World Rugby have done it better with the men's World Cup in regards to TV timings and breaks in between games. Um, I'm very thankful that all the games are taking place over weekends and no weekday games. I think that's apart from the opening game where England played the US on opening night, which was on a Friday evening. I think they've got that right with the scheduling in that sense, where they've not had any weekday games, and they did obviously have a Friday night game to open the tournament. But their scheduling, it's leaving things a bit tight, and they're doing a lot of double headers at stadiums. Now, I will say this: the playing surfaces have held up really well. Admittedly, with the amount of rain we've had over the last week or so, the playing surfaces have held up well. I would also put that down to a very dry summer. And they've also, with the Women's Rugby World Cup, it's starting a month earlier than the men's one would. So those playing surfaces have had less use, if that makes sense, because they're also using football stadiums as well as rugby stadiums. So York and Brighton, for example, and the Stadium of Light, they're football stadiums as well as rugby stadiums. Where in York's case, it's a rugby league and a football stadium, but they're using stadiums that aren't normally used for rugby union, and the playing surfaces have held up quite well. I'm kind of glad the playing surfaces have held up reasonably well, and so far the crowds have been really good. The crowds have been really, really good. I think I was a bit concerned in regards to the promotion aspect of it. Had they gone with enough promotion for the tournament? Had they promoted the tournament well enough? I think they have. I think ticket sales have been really good. Already broken attendance records. So, I mean, the opening night broke an attendance record in regards to the amount of fans that turned up. So, definitely fans have bought in. It's good. Um, no, Wales haven't got the depth that England have, but the depth is improving. But they haven't got the depth that England have at the moment. England always seem to get Andorra or San Marino in the qualifiers. Yeah, I mean, look, I don't know how they figure out the qualifying groups, but a lot of nations seem to get each other a lot, and it's not just England getting San Marino or Andorra in the qualifying group. Although I think England last had Andorra in like 2006. But in saying that, well, it might have been a bit later. But in saying that, it's Wales, Belgium. There are some nations that seem to be drawn consistently in the same qualifying groups. And with the amount of nations within Europe, you would think they would rotate them around a little bit. I do find it interesting when it's interesting that Wales and France don't seem to cross paths. I don't know how UEFA decides the qualifying groups for each tournament. I really don't know. I don't know if the Nations League has a part to play in that. Not that I'm a fan of the Nations League. I never have been. I've never really bought into the Nations League. I think it's an unnecessary. I mean, I know why they brought it in, because people were complaining about the pointless friendlies where managers would change the entire lineup at half time. Because they weren't competitive internationals, so they thought we'll bring in these competitive. If you're playing the same countries all the time, yes, I think that would become rather boring. As I say, I just don't understand how. I don't know the formula that UEFA used to select who's in what qualification group. Is it to do with world ranking and seeding? I mean, there's got to be a method they put into the algorithm, into the computer to draw it, unless it's done by human drawing. But again, a prelim qualifying round, then I mean, obviously we want to see the lesser nations improve and improve in quality. And in that regard, San Marino now got their first international win. Well, they've actually won 2 internationals, I think, now. So in that regard, some of these lesser nations are starting to get better. Their players at club level are starting to play and get recognition and start to play at a higher club level. At the same time, when the same nations continually play each other in the qualifying segment, that I think can get a bit boring. I don't think a prelim qualifier is necessarily the way to go. Some people might argue the Nations League should be the prelim, but I don't know. Well, you can argue that, but if suddenly you've got 30 or 40 players playing in Serie A and the Swiss League and the various top leagues, or in La Liga in the French league, then suddenly that changes the conversation. Andorra's got a bigger population than 30k though. That's San Marino numbers or Monaco numbers, but I get the point that when you've got a limited population size, you might have to rely on expats, those who've got a grandparent or a parent. But a lot of countries do that. And it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of Andorrans who live outside Andorra, because people have, guess what? People have, emigrated. You could probably find, it's like Ireland, for example, there are more Irish people living outside of Irish descent who, in theory, could play for the Irish national side, or Northern Ireland for that matter, through a grandparent, because of where they've ended up. The amount of Americans who claim they're Irish yet they've never stepped foot in the UK or the Republic of Ireland and all that. And we're talking, yeah. But no, you've got the grandparent rule, you've got residency rule. But at the same time, look, the lesser nations, I mean, look, oh yeah, all nations do it. If you can find a player who qualifies by a grandparent and they're good enough, you are going to approach them and you are going to offer them, do you want to play for us? Oh, look, you're half and half. You're half Irish, half, I don't know, Spanish, for example. You're not going to get in the Spain side, but you can get in the Ireland side because we've got less top-level players. Yeah, his mum's Polish, though. And he's got 2 Polish grandparents. So I think, yeah, look, he's born in Berlin, but his mum's Polish, and fair play to him, and he's done quite well for Poland. And look, he got overlooked by England, and it's England's loss and it's Poland's game because he's a decent player. He's obviously had the discussion with his family, and he's decided that's the route for him. Fair play to him. Fair play to him. You can't blame him for taking an opportunity when the England system has overlooked him. Can't blame him for that. Well, tell that to he's Welsh or Scottish, but there's a fair few players who play for Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland and the Republic who have very English accents because they were brought up in England. John Aldridge springs to mind as a very, very fiery Scouser who played for Ireland. England and Wales, that border area in Herefordshire and Gloucestershire is a bit, and Monmouthshire is a bit, vague. But look, I think there's one of the Irish players in the Women's Rugby World Cup. Was an England under-20 international. So even we've seen it in rugby union. We see it in football. We've seen it in cricket. We've seen it regularly in rugby league. Christ, we've seen it a lot in rugby league. We've seen it in ice hockey. It happens. Scott McTominay, famous one. He sounds like he's from Cheshire, probably because he's lived in Cheshire most of his life. Yeah, but his parents are Scottish, and look, I think he's doing really. I mean, McTominay's doing really well at Napoli. Let's not kid ourselves. The way, I mean, we could discuss Manchester United, or rather not, but it gets clicked. But Manchester United is a basket case of a club at the moment. Thoughts on Payne-Haas choosing to play for Samoa? We're seeing a lot more of this now because they brought in this Pacific Championship, and we've seen a drive from Tonga and Samoa and Fiji to try and get their players back, their best players playing for them again, who otherwise would have played for Australia, New Zealand, or even the British and Irish Lions / England, for example. And Tyson Frizzell, for example, was played for Wales, amongst other things, and Tonga. I think you'll find. I think my thoughts on it. I mean, look. Obviously, he's played State of Origin, and there's that debate about an Origin player should, if you play Origin, you should play for Australia. That is an interesting one. There's a lot of players who can represent Australia but represent other countries, and I mean, it's a complex one. We want to see, the Pacific Island nations grow. We want to see growth in the global game of rugby league in the sense of the international game. I think that's where rugby league seriously is lacking behind rugby union in that regard. And I think a lot of this was sparked by the performance of Tonga in 2017 at the World Cup in that semi-final. And they should have beaten England. I'm not going to lie, they should have beaten England. And then not long after that, Tonga did beat Australia. And that then created a debate within the rugby league community in Australia and New Zealand about strengthening the Pacific Island nations and actually should their best players be playing for Australia and New Zealand, or should they be playing for the country of their parents or grandparents' heritage? Some of them were actually born in Samoa and Tonga rather than in Australia and New Zealand. And that we've had this debate in rugby union as well. It's an ongoing debate about the pillaging of the tier 2 nations to suit the tier 1 nations, the top nations in both codes of rugby. This debate's been had for a very, very long time. It's been going on for 30 plus years. There is a big debate about international selection rules, and I'm going to have to move. I think my back is absolutely shot. But this debate's been had for a very, very long time. It's not a new debate. We're having it in a lot of international sports when it comes to international allegiance, especially if a person has already represented another country. We are now seeing changes in selection rules. Now, it's an interesting one. It doesn't bother me either way. I think it's Samoa's gain, Australia's loss, but Australia's got some very good front row forwards, and so I don't know what you can make of that. It's a personal choice, but then the debate about the Origin selection and if you get selected for Origin, should you be eligible to play for other nations other than Australia? It's a complex issue. We obviously want to see these emerging nations become more than just emerging nations, where actually they can win test matches against England, New Zealand and Australia on a regular, rather than just the one-off win or pushing them close. The fact that Samoa made a World Cup final after Tonga made a semi-final, I think, is a big statement in the growth of the game. And you look at the players that played in that Tonga side in 2017 and the Samoa side in the delayed 2022 World Cup, which should have been played in 2021. You look at the players, they would have played for Australia and New Zealand. They would have. They would have been eligible for selection for Australia and New Zealand, and they decided to go, no, we're going with our heritage. And fair play to them. Fair play to them. It still was creating a debate. I don't know what the perfect solution is around state of origin. That's a debate that the New South Wales Rugby League and the Queensland Rugby League and the NRL and the Australian Rugby League Commission need to have. and it needs to be a grown-up discussion with grown-up solutions. But we'll see. Yes, Owen Morgan, yeah, Irishman playing for England. There's been a few who've represented both Ireland and England, but it's an interesting one because obviously Ireland gained Test status after he switched allegiance. So I imagine if he'd stayed with the island set up when they became a Test nation, I think that would have benefited them. But that's an interesting one. You know, we've seen that with a few players. Argentina deserve a Lions tour. How the logistics would work. I think Uruguay and Chile probably get test matches as well, which are classed as full tests. The issue with Argentina is the state of the economy, the transport infrastructure, and also the hotel infrastructure, the stadium, the infrastructure in general, be it stadiums, transport, the logistics, the hotels. I wouldn't say Argentina's as dangerous as some other South American countries in regards to gang crime. And violent crime, but it's still not as safe as Australia and New Zealand. South Africa can be quite dangerous, obviously, and is quite dangerous. But when it comes to rugby union, the nation stops. So Argentina, I mean, look, it's an interesting one. I think on a playing standpoint and a merit standpoint, they do, but then there's a lot of rugby politics to go with that in regards to the South African Union, the New Zealand Union, and the Australian Union. And how they are going to feel about having to wait an extra 4 years for a Lions tour. I think it happens. I think the logistics can work in regards to you play 3 tests against Argentina, and I think you would have to play a test against Uruguay, a test against Chile, and a test against Brazil, or you play a test against the Barbarians or something. To make up a six match tour, and that would obviously benefit just South American international rugby union and benefit the game down there. Uruguay and Chile are both got pretty decent sides, and Brazil's an emerging nation as well with a good sevens program. I think the fact that women qualify for the Women's World Cup for the first time, again, we're seeing the growth in the game in South America outside of the traditional countries of the Southern Cone, as they call it, which is Uruguay, Chile, and Argentina. We are seeing that growth. I think World Rugby could do something to assist, but I do think Argentina deserves a Lions tour. Yes. No, the USA are nowhere close to a Lions tour yet. Not even close. If the women are going to get a Lions tour for the first time, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and I think Canada will be the nations they tour because they're the nations that are competitive and the top nations. The US is not on the same level as Canada, England, New Zealand, even South Africa, Australia. They're just not on the same level at the moment, although they did have that draw with Australia. The US have gone backwards as time has gone on over recent years in the women's game. The US will not get a Lions tour in the men's game, not for a very, very long time. Not for a very long time. I don't know. I think you could do a Lions tour every year that's not a World Cup year. I think that'd be pretty cool. Doing a Lions tour every year that's not a World Cup year and just taking it's like little Harlem Globetrotters. That'd be kind of cool. But a lot of people questioned the viability and the future of the Lions setup, the Lions tour, and whether it has a place in the modern game. You look at the money it brought into Australian rugby this summer. It cleared their debts. And so when people are saying, is there a viability behind it anymore? Does it have a place anymore? Is it an archaic leftover from the amateur days? Well, we still see Barbarians matches. People say is the Barbars an archaic institution. I would say it still has a part to play in the modern game to a degree, but I do think having it every 4 years, maybe you could do it for 3 straight years. World Cup year, not have it, and then the next in between World Cup cycles, where you tour the nations. But would I keep? I mean, you could do it like that. I think we have the World Cup every 4 years, but the Six Nations is every year. The European Championships every year. I think they've brought back the Americas Championships for the first time since COVID. I think, or is it the Pacific Nations Championship, the first time since COVID, or whatever it is. The Rugby Championship. I mean, you've got these yearly international competitions, and then you have the World Cup. It's an interesting one. The arguments there. We know about the financial crisis that rugby union is finding itself in regards to the finances of the sport and centralised contracts and professionalism and semi-professionalism and amateur, the club game, the international game. We know there's financial issues. We know they are serious. We know that obviously Wales is in a real mess. We know in Scotland the future of the women's centralised contracts is in doubt, and we have a lot of uncertainty around the women's game in both Wales and Scotland. I think in cricket, yes, I do think in cricket I think cricket, they overdo it with the Ashes. I really do. I think they should be every 4 years. I think the rivalry has sort of lost. It's been devalued, but in part this is because the ICC, which is basically run by India, with Australia and England basically being India's lieutenants, those 3 countries get the majority of the TV revenue and sponsorship and funding, and then you have South Africa and New Zealand, who come next. Then you have Bangladesh and Sri Lanka as the next nations off the rank, and then you get the West Indies. And that's the structure of how the test setup and the ODI and the T20s and all that. And they have overdone it. They have bled the cash cow dry. I think it's overdone. It's lost its magic, and it doesn't mean as much. It just doesn't. It should be every 4 years, yes. I wouldn't say rugby union's at its worst since 95, but the sport has drastically changed since 1995 in the way it's played. In the law changes, if you want to be, proper bookworm, law changes they brought in. I do think that I do think rugby union is at crossroads. I wouldn't say it's at the worst it's ever been, but I would argue that the game has changed massively over the last 30 years. That, for example, my dad passed away 15 years ago. If he was still alive today and he hadn't watched rugby for 15 years, which I highly doubt because he was rugby mad, I would hazard a guess that he wouldn't recognise the sport he was watching, and he'll be questioning a lot of the things, going, why has that rule changed or that law changed? And if you were to get a fan who was watching the game when the World Cup was hosted in South Africa in 1995, who hadn't watched the game for 30 years, let's say young kid growing up, obviously in a rugby passionate family here in the UK, for example, moves to America, where it's less popular. Unless you're on the West Coast or in Texas at university, you're highly unlikely to play it, or in New England. If you're in the Midwest, let's say your family's moved to Nebraska or Kansas, for whatever reason, probably, let's say dad or mum works for a big corporation based out in Omaha, Nebraska, or Kansas City, Missouri. There you go. Some Midwestern cities. They've moved out there. It's American football or baseball, potentially ice hockey. They're the sports you're probably going to play at high school, probably going to play at university. And you're most likely going to watch American football, baseball, potentially ice hockey if you come under the right TV market in regards, or NBA or basketball, if you, depending on the TV market you come under. They're the sports you're exposed to. The MLS obviously comes along in the 90s as well, but obviously it's a global sport. US regularly qualifies for the FIFA World Cup, so it does get coverage. But these are the sports you're watching on the TV. These are the sports you're playing at high school. And then they were to move back to the UK as an adult. And they were to watch the game again. They'd be like, what am I watching? They could have spent 30, they could have been 10, 15 years old. They moved to the US or a country where rugby union is less popular. They move back to a country where it is popular. And they go, what sport am I watching? If they were to go that the game has changed too much, then yes, you could argue rugby's in a bad place. I think there's been slow change over time. And I still have the 2003 Rugby World Cup on VHS, which you can also get on DVD, of all the tries of every game. And you can see then till now, 22 years, there has been massive changes, yes. Massive changes. I wouldn't say it's at its worst, but I do think world rugby in the last, I'm going to say from 2019 onwards, so basically COVID onwards, have been very reactionary in some, if not all, the rule changes they have implemented, law changes. I think they've been very reactionary rather than proactionary. I think other sports like rugby league or ice hockey are taking a better lead in regards to the concussion protocols and managing head contact and rightly punishing head contact as well in a more appropriate way, and dealing with getting players to adjust their collisions, tackles, hits, that kind of thing. You're not going to take head contact out of these team collision sports. It's not going to happen. I think World Rugby are exceptionally naive to think that it is going to happen. They're not going to take head contact out of the game. There will always be incidental head contact, and I've already got my views on the 20-minute red card and the TMO review system that they've had in place now for a couple of years. The 20-minute red card is a newer addition, but it's a tweak on the rules they had at the Men's World Cup 2 years ago. I've got my views on that, got my thoughts on that. It's a flawed system, it's inconsistent, and we've seen inconsistencies over the first 3 weekends of the tournament. Great to see Paraguay qualify for a World Cup for the first time. It's always good to see another a nation get back to a World Cup. Some nations, it's a long time between drinks in between international tournaments. There's some great players who've played for Paraguay over the years. I like South American qualifying. Well, there's only a limited number of nations in CONMEBOL, so it's always quite competitive. And Brazil were not in good shape for a lengthy portion of the qualifying campaign. They were struggling for a while. Bolivia put them in UEFA, they probably qualify. Well, there's more qualifying spots. There's more spots for European UEFA nations to get to the World Cup. So there's more chance, but there's also more nations trying to battle to get there. I wouldn't say Bolivia would actually be that good. I mean, Venezuela are the only South American nation not to have appeared at a World Cup. I think, well, Bolivia are at home. They play at altitude. And Brazil and Venezuela will not like that because most of their professional clubs are at sea level or very close to sea level. No, Brazil, look, I wouldn't say Brazil are not a force. They're just not playing particularly well at the moment. And I do think the style of play, the modern style of play doesn't, well, the modern club style of play with the slow build-up possession from the back, which everyone hates, yet every manager wants to do, which is the most antiseptic, anti-fun, anti-enjoyment, goes against the Brazilian natural style, which has also been coached out of them since the World Cup in '94. And then it has been coached out of them. Brazil, amongst all the South American nations, were famed for their attacking flair, their spontaneity, their quick-paced attacks, but also their brutal, niggly defence and some of their dirty play. Do I blame Pep? The irony is, I kind of do. I think tiki taka is not just Pep's fault. It's Spain. But they had a crop of very technically able players, including centre backs who could play that style for about a 5-10 year period. Crop of players. The Spanish class of '92, I would call them. They would be the class of '98, 2000 kind of. They had a crop of players who could play that style because of the technical ability and the style of play that was coached at a couple of clubs, not just Barcelona. You've got to remember that. It wasn't just Barcelona where this style of play was played. They just happened to be the most consistent at it. But I do think it's a very anti-football style. It takes a lot of the energy and enjoyment out of watching the game as neutral, and you need the players to do it. This is why I enjoy Crystal Palace winning the FA Cup, because they found a way that counteracted the slow, methodical, ticky-tacky passing build-up that Man City had. Quick-paced counter-attack does it every time. That ball over the fast wingers, ball over the top, physical centre forward, and a floating midfielder who can pick up scraps and then distribute. Palace, Glasner even said to Pep when they lost, they were leading 2-0, they lost 5-2. Glasner said to Pep, "You play like that again, we're going to beat you." And the next time they played each other was the FA Cup final, and Pep played the same way because he's arrogant, and they lost. And it's not the first time a Man City side of a Pep Guardiola has lost 1-0 playing that way, where they overplay, they're passing it around with arrogance, they get undone and they get embarrassed, and then Pep's looking like an absolute moron. I mean, Liverpool under Klopp used a 4-3-3 high energy press. They did Man City a couple of times. I don't know how Eric Ten Hag managed to win 2 trophies and 2 finals against Man City with Man United, but he did. And they just played with energy and speed. That's what defeats it. Run at them. I don't like the modern game. It's not as entertaining. It's not as fun. The flair's been coached out of it. The players used to play with spontaneity and play what's in front of them. It's been coached out of them. Players are now fearful to attempt to do stuff. You've got defenders now who think they're prime Luis Figo. Well, Crystal Palace has proven you can do it. Atalanta has proven you can do it. I mean, to be fair, Bayer Leverkusen under Xabi Alonso proved you could do it as well, playing their style, which is different. It's all about fast-paced, positive passing, done quickly, none of this passing at the back. Atalanta were brilliant in that Europa League final against Bayer Leverkusen. They were brilliant. It was refreshing to see a team play that way. Palace, ultimate smash and grab job. Loved it. I think it was deserved. But you look at footage from the 90s, the 2000s, early 2010s. I mean, yeah, tiki-taka is dominating European football, but teams are willing to pass and move, but do it quick, pass it long, ball over the top, whip crosses in. Not try and score the perfect goal, but whip crosses in, fight for rebounds. You're not seeing that. Not seeing that at all. I think the players are overcoached. I think attacking flair players are having that flair and playing what's in front of them and just playing what they see and communicating with their teammates. Just go there. Stop at the coach. Just go there. Being coached out of them. There's no freedom of expression. We're losing the characters from the game because now they are also coached in how to give interviews. They're given media coaching. They are robotic. Their passion's been drained out of them. And yeah, the game is not the same. I don't enjoy it. I really don't enjoy it at all as much as I'll still watch it. I'll still do the match reviews. I'll still discuss, player movement if I think it warrants it. I didn't do anything on Alexander Isak because I think that was just a farce. It was embarrassing. He's no player is worth. Look, I've said this about the transfer market for a very long time. It is heavily overinflated. It's artificially inflated. It's distorting the finances of the sport. Neymar was not worth 250 million, which was the final fee of that transfer with add-ons. Ishak is not worth 125. I mean, some of these transfer fees now are obscene. Absolutely obscene. I remember when Alan Shearer was the most expensive player in the world at 16 million back in 1996 when Blackburn sold him to Newcastle United. I was pissed off as a Blackburn fan that we sold him, but that's neither here nor there. But that was the record transfer at the time, which was very, very quickly broken within 12 months. 16 million. That doesn't get you an average defender now. Average defender is ridiculous. The Rugby 360 competition, do I think it sees the light of day? The reporting on that's gone very, very quiet all of a sudden. It's gone very, very quiet. There was a lot of concern, especially in rugby league circles, especially around the NRL, not so much here in Super League, but down in Australia and New Zealand with the NRL, that there are some players coming off contracts at a time when the game is expanding with the Perth Bears coming in 27 and the PNG team are meant to be coming in 28. So we are seeing expansion. There's going to be a 20th team announced at some point within the next 5-year time frame after 2027. So we've got expansion on the horizon, so you're going to need players. The Super League is also expanding, and we're seeing restructuring of the Championship in League One. We are seeing issues with rugby union as it currently stands with Wales and Scotland, even New Zealand and Australia. I mean, look, the Lions Tour paid Australia's debts with Rugby Australia. That hasn't fixed their structural issues, and they'll be back in debt very, very quickly. Just because they've made some money off a Lions Tour doesn't mean the structural problems that Rugby Australia has have been fixed. It just papers over the cracks. They got some money for a little bit. In regards to the Isak transfer saga, I will get back to the R360. I don't know. I don't think it does. There's been no concrete plans on anything. No players have signed up for it. But we'll see what happens. Watch this space. We'll see what happens there. But again, it's Saudi money, and that started. The Arab oil money from the Gulf is starting to distort sport again. They're throwing money around. It started obviously with Man City in 2007, 2008. PSG with the Qataris. It's sort of the last 10, 15, nearly 20 years. It's sort of built a momentum slowly, and now it's sped up and sped up and sped up. I would watch this space, but I'm not overly concerned right now with it. Win at all costs. Yeah. The Isak transfer saga, it did. What's my thoughts on these players like Visa, Guy Koresh and Ishak? They're better. They're not as good as they think they are. B, we have to look at the role of player agents, and also the role of the other clubs. Is they're tapping up, which is an offence, which is against the rules, and the role of player agents in this, because Ishak had 3 years left on his deal. I think Visa had years left on his deal. Guy Koresh, I'm not so sure about, but I know with Visa, he wanted to go to Newcastle. Ishak wanted to go to Liverpool, which he did in the end. And Guy Koresh, I think, where did he end up? I can't remember where he ended up now. Obviously not that important. But I do think there. I'm surprised the PFA haven't got involved and come out. I'm surprised the League Managers Association hasn't come out and said something. These are the two unions that look after players and managers. And we need to ask questions over the player agents and their role in this. Because there's player agents and sports agents in general, there's a lot of discussion about their involvement in basically contracts now are not worth the money they're printed on. They're breached all the time. We see it in the NRL and rugby league. We see it in football. We see it in motorsport in regards to driver contracts. We see it in a lot of sports. It's an interesting one in regards to the role of player agents or sports agents. I think there are a lot of good agents out there who have integrity, who look after their clients and make sure that you are being treated fairly. There's nothing dodgy going on. Here's your bonuses. Here's your deal. You've got your 3 or your 5 year contract, or whatever length it is. You've got a bit of job certainty. There you go. I'll see you in 3-5 years' time when you want to extend. And on your way, I'll take my fee. I've made a bit of money. And then you've got these player agents who deliberately agitate for moves because they get their 10%. And I did watch that documentary with Danny Murphy and the other former football players who were defrauded out of their money, the V11 group, although there's up to anywhere between 200 and 300, maybe more former and current football players and other individuals in a variety of sports who had basically, obviously, a lot of pro athletes realize their careers are generally very, very short. There's a high risk of bad injury and subsequent health issues. And they were young, they had a lot of money, didn't know what to do with it, wanted to make sure that their families, like their parents or siblings or loved ones, were looked after. And basically these wealth asset management funds and companies came along, and I think it's Kingsbridge is the one that's mentioned, but apparently there are others, and they fraudulently nicked their money, basically, and weren't doing things correctly, and they ripped off their clients, made money. And what annoys me about this is not that, it's Premier League football players. Obviously, they made a lot of money. You look at the wages they were on at the time; they're not massive amounts of money, ironically. And before tax, they were, let's say, I was earning £6,000 a week before tax. And at the time, I can't remember what the top rate of tax was. Was it 40 or 45% of that was taken in income tax, PAYE, and national insurance made up a proportion of that. So they would have had about 50% of their earnings taken in tax. And then you work out 52 weeks in a year, tax year. They weren't on massive amounts of money then, back in the 90s, compared to what they are now. And they have had their life savings, in some cases, stolen. Some of them have been made homeless. And I watched the documentary earlier today, and I was absolutely stunned that these players that I grew up watching in the 90s and 2000s, I think one of them whose wife is actually a trained solicitor, who's actually, I forget his name, but he played for Blackburn. He won the League Cup with us in 2002. But some of these players are actually reasonably clued up. And a few of them quite early on realised something's not quite right here. And that documentary, I mean, look, a lot of people say they're overpaid, whatever. But it's also happening to regular people like you and me who get recommended through a friend, for example. Oh, this is asset management scheme. You can invest, you get a return, and you can sort of have like a pension pot kind of thing for a rainy day. Like you put, and they were having their life savings nicked. And then with the way the law currently is, even though you're a victim of fraud, you're still liable for the tax bill. So there's one of them who owes about 20, 25 million in back taxes that he cannot afford. That will bankrupt him, will lose his house, and all sorts. So there's got to be questions about how these financial advisors, and we hear a lot about this in a lot of sports, get their claws into the players. And again, agents will introduce them to a financial advisor. They're getting a fee, all this kind of stuff. There's a lot of murkies going on, and at the end of the day, a lot of these young athletes are not necessarily, I wouldn't say the brightest, but or not very bright because they're good at what they do. They have great sports knowledge, but they weren't necessarily didn't do the best at school. A lot of them are from very humble backgrounds, and they didn't grow up with much, and they're suddenly offered all this money. And we've seen agents get deregistered in various sports because they've not guided their clients very well and they've nicked money. Isaac Moses has been deregistered multiple times for some of his dealings that are verging on criminal in Australia in regards to the NRL. So that's my thoughts on the whole. Oh, I'm glad my mum's an accountant. So when I reach the point where I've got to start declaring this as self-employed in a business, and I've got to, well, if I ever earn enough in a calendar year to meet the taxable threshold to then go self-employed with this as an income, my mum's an accountant. I've got a couple of mates who are accountants. So in that regard, I think I'll be all right. But at the same time, and I do mean this, a lot of these young men, predominantly young men in professional football, but other sports as well, were trusting in, because these financial advisors got the managers and the club directors hooked in as well and nicked their money. I mean, Howard Wilkinson was the chair of the LMA, the League Managers Association, for 4 or 5 years in the 90s, and he was getting paid nearly $3,000 a month by this financial investment firm who were nicking all the money of all the players and ripping them off and forging documents and skimming money. He was getting paid money, and he was recommending players that played for him. It's just ridiculous. Lasana Diarra, Lokomotiv Moscow case going on. Diarra's favour has something to do with it. Again, a Russian football club with what's going on with sanctions and sporting bans and all that. I don't know enough about that case, but you've got the Bosman ruling, which is enshrined in law. It's actually the Bosman ruling is enshrined in employment law, so especially in the sports realm. Heard pundits already. So I can't really comment on the Lasana Diarra, but I know there's a few players and contract disputes, but we have the Bosman rule. I'm surprised that these players who wanted to get a transfer done and the club was refusing didn't decide to invoke the Bosman rule. It's there. It's rarely used, and generally when players use it, their careers then tend to not really recover after a Bosman ruling has gone in their favour. But there's the option to use the Bosman rule under the European under employment law. It's enshrined in law. You've heard pundits complaining about the 48 team World Cup already, and we haven't even kicked a ball yet. Look, ironically, you get an extra week of games, which means the media gets more airtime, which means they get paid more money, and they're. Oh, dear. I do think, yes, the World Cup may have got a little bit too big. I think 32 was a perfect number of teams, personally. A lot of people did. But 48 is where we're at. It was very, I mean, look, every time the World Cup expanded, people complained. But actually, I think the 32 team World Cup format worked really, really well. But it also means more revenue. It means we get to see more countries at the tournament who otherwise we wouldn't see, and more players we otherwise wouldn't see. And that in itself is a good thing. At the same time, look, we're already seeing a shortened off season. We are already seeing, I think, a rise in injuries. We've had to see rule changes or law changes, if you want to be a traditionalist. We've seen a lot of rule changes and a lot of frustration with some of these rule changes and interpretation and law changes and things like that. I don't think we get to 64. If we get when we've reached that point, we're going to have a pre-tournament, like another tournament, like a pre-tournament, to then get to the main tournament. We'd have to split it. I don't think we'll get to that stage because then no one will want to host it because of the sheer volume of players, team officials, coaches, not including fans and media, the sheer infrastructure you would need. It's too much. I think 48, look, we've reached a point now where that's what we've got. What one nation can no longer host the tournament by itself. It's just it's not viable. We've got 3 nations co-hosting next year. We'll see how it plays out, but the heat of the North American summer, I mean, that's going to be brutal. I think the temperatures will be brutal. We saw it in the FIFA Club World Cup. The temperatures were brutal then. The kickoff times didn't work. The American fans said the kickoff times didn't work. They were too early in the day because of the TV audience that the FIFA hoped they would get in Europe and Asia, and it didn't pan out. They did not get the TV audience they wanted. They didn't get the fans and attendance they wanted, so they started slashing ticket prices. They were reducing ticket prices to nearly pennies because they weren't getting fans through the turnstiles. And people were telling me in the comments section when I said, look, this has been an absolute failure. Oh, but the World Cup, it will draw fans. Yeah, it will draw fans, but at the same time, you've got American government policy in regards to domestic and foreign on a variety of issues that a lot of people around the world don't agree with. There's been a lot of negative reaction to the US domestic and foreign policy, and travel to the US from nations outside the US is drastically down. Now, Canada and Mexico is a different thing, but the crowd numbers were concerning. The kickoff times did not work, which then meant you were playing in the heat of the day, which meant heat breaks, and then you had thunderstorms, which happen. They just happen. Weather breaks, and the US are terrified of being sued. So, oh, lightning's too close. We've got to stop the game for 3 hours. Whereas other countries like, lightning's over there, but it's not close enough yet. We'll carry on playing until it literally hits the stadium. But I think it's an interesting one. I will say this: Morocco also wanted the World Cup. They didn't get it. Now, the next World Cup will be the centenary tournament, and so multiple nations are involved with the hosting. The one after that in 2034 is going to be Saudi Arabia. And I can't see that working. I don't think Qatar works personally because we've still got a very disrupted domestic club schedule now that we're still dealing with following the World Cup in 2022. And that's me being critical. We're still feeling the effects nearly 3 years later of the 2022 World Cup. We are still feeling the scheduling impacts on domestic leagues around the world 3 years later. 3 years. And I think FIFA have lost their way a little bit. And lost their way a little bit is an understatement, but you know what I mean. I think they're taking the sport in a dangerous direction, which is fracturing the sport at its core. And we're seeing a breakdown in trust between the fans, us, the governing bodies at various levels, be it nationally or internationally, and club owners and leagues. And we are seeing that breakdown in the ecosystem of the sport. Well, you can see the transfer window is going away completely. That will be interesting. Like the North American sports have a trade deadline. Normally about 2 months before the playoffs start. As soon as the playoffs end, trade window opens again until the next trade deadline. So they don't have a transfer windows. They literally have 2 months of the 2.5, 3 months of the year where you're not allowed to have any player movement, and the rest of the year you can. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I think with the way we're heading, I think leagues will bring in salary caps. And with that, they would also bring in transfer caps as well, and a cap on transfer fees. I honestly think at some point, the rules they brought in are the new PSR rules, which are a replacement for financial fair play, aren't working as intended. They're being abused. We can see they're being abused and worked around. I think I just don't know. I think the players are part of the problem, or player agents. I think a lot of players further down the pyramid actually would go, you know what, we earn decent money. The system doesn't work. I think a proportion of players at the top level of the pyramid are causing a lot of problems. And I think we're going to see a point where we reach a point where it can't sustain itself. It can't. Fans are being priced out, and the economy, the football. I've had this argument before. The footballing economy is basically run on debt. It's the sporting equivalent of the subprime mortgage crisis that we had in the 2000s that led to the financial collapse nearly 20 years ago. I cannot believe the financial crash came 18 years ago, or started 18 years ago with Northern Rock and then spread through the various banking systems around the world. But that's basically what we've got with professional football. It's almost like a Ponzi scheme. It's run on debt. It's a mess. The player wages are out of control. Agents are out of control. Not all players. A lot of players are actually quite decent people. Um, you know, they're quite, a lot of them are quite humble, but there's a proportion that aren't. The wages are obscene. The cost to the fan is excessive. Fans are being priced out. And the transfer fees have got out of control. To me, it's no longer the sport I grew up watching. It's not the sport I grew up watching 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I was 15. So, okay, 25 years ago, 30 years. When I was a kid in the 90s and early 2000s, I don't recognise the sport anymore. I don't. I generally don't recognise the sport that I fell in love with when I was, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. I don't recognise it at all. I enjoy watching it a lot less. But as I say, I will still do match reviews. I will still do discussion around managerial sackings, club near collapses with Morecambe. I mean, I will do a video on Sheffield Wednesday at some point because I am concerned that Sheffield Wednesday will cease to exist. Will end up in a similar position as Reading were at the end of last season. Reading were in a mess similar. And we've reached this point because of weak governance over a very, very long time. And a lot. I think I will say about the same about rugby union. I don't feel the same about rugby union anymore. I've fallen out of love with rugby union a bit, and I have been watching the Women's Rugby World Cup. And don't get me wrong, fair play to those girls playing. They're doing fantastic. But a lot of the rule changes, for me, have drastically changed the sport from what it was 30 years ago. The sport I grew up playing when I was a kid is not the same sport that I watch now. And I mean that. The sport I grew up watching and playing as a kid, that I played again as an adult in my early 20s, I do not recognise now in the same way. It's changed drastically. And I'm not sure that it's necessarily changes for the good long-term future of the sport. I'm falling out of love with it. I don't enjoy it as much. Admittedly, a lot of my best videos, ironically, are rugby union videos in regards to engagement and view counts and comments and likes and new subscribers. I get that. Same with rugby league, ironically. Some of my best performing videos are rugby league and rugby union related. I will say that, but the sports have drastically changed, and I understand taking the fighting out of the game of both union and league. I understand that, although a lot of people do miss the aggro and the biff and the punch ups, and fans miss that. They do. They feel the sport is overly sanitized, and you'll even get it from female fans saying, "Bring back the biff. We want to see proper gladiatorial combat." But at the same time, when you've got former players like Stuart Fielding and Willie Mason, when they went on the James Graham podcast, on Jimmy Graham's podcast, and Willie Mason going, yeah, that was how the game was played at the time in the 2000s. It was, you would bash each other and then fight. But he did say this. He goes, right, they're promoting this 3-test series, or any time they've got internationals, and they will always bring up Willie Mason knocking out Stuart Fielding with that one punch. And he goes, if they are serious about what they're saying in regards to concussions and head injuries and foul play, player welfare. Why are they using that as promotionary material for, and when you've got the ex-players saying, we're kind of glad the fighting is out the game now, while the fans may want it back, a lot of the ex-players are like, you know what, we're kind of glad the fighting is out the game now. It did shorten careers. It did lead to injuries. Ice hockey is the only sport left where fighting is basically sort of, it's okay. And fighting in ice hockey is down from where it was at peak in the late 80s into the late 90s, early 2000s. It really peaked. The Ben Flower incident with Lance Ohio. Well, Ben Flower subsequently failed a couple of steroids tests, and I think he's also gone to prison for drug trafficking. Ben Flower, I've got to look into him, but he ended Lance Ohio's career. It was gutless, and that weren't a fight. That weren't a fight. That's not a proper Wigan St Helens brawl or a Leeds Bradford brawl or a State of Origin brawl where they're going toe to toe. And that was a gutless, cowardly sucker punch to a defenseless player on the ground who was already, I think, potentially knocked out from the bad tackle, and then he broke his face. He actually fractured his skull with that, and left him with a bleeding brain. I believe Lance Ohio had complications, and he never fully recovered from it. And there was health complications for Lance Ohio where he had to retire medically. I don't think he ever played again. But I know he had a fractured skull from that. He literally was defenseless. Subsequently, Ben Flower, I've got to look up on him, but I think he went to prison, and I do believe he did fail a couple of doping tests as well. Whether that was the turning point or not, I think at that point, fighting, I think, was a suspendable offence in club games, but I think league international rules stated that fighting in international at that point wasn't banned. It wasn't a suspendable offence. But I do think that was a turning point. Yeah. No, it wasn't a good look. People still talk about that incident today, all these years later, because it's one of the most gutless, controversial moments in professional sport, not just rugby league, but any sport where it's a classless act. I don't think we really got much of an apology from Ben Flower. I think there was a kind of I'm sorry I did it, but he's not got the best track record himself later on in his career. He got a few bans in his career for various things. I'm actually going to check up because I believe he went to prison. I think Ben Flower actually went to prison, but I know he got suspended for doping offences. But I'm going to check on Ben Flower because I remember, not that I'm a Sky Sports fan, but I remember watching the highlights and there was a big thing made about it. It was on the news. He was Welsh. Wow, he's only 37. He's a former rugby league. Okay, he last played for the Lee Centurions when they were the Lee Centurions, not the Lee Leopards. So that just tells you how long ago it's been since he played, because they rebranded several years ago. Let's have a look. He was born in 1987, so he's 2 years older than me. He's a Welsh-born. He was born in Cardiff. He actually started out playing in rugby union at the Newport Gwent Dragons. So he started out at the Crusaders in 2008. He went on loan to the South Wales Scorpions in 2010. In 2012, he signed with Wigan until 2020. And then in 2021, he was playing for Lee Centurions. He only played 5 games in the 2021 season. So he was a second row loose forward. Yeah, so he punched Lance Hahaya in the face twice in the second minute of the grand final in 2014. And I think the first one actually knocked him out when he's standing, and then when he's basically unconscious on the floor, he smashes him. He got a 6-month ban for that. Born in Cardiff, playing career, Wigan Warriors. Right. So on the 11th of October 2014, which is the grand final, he became the first player to be sent off after being shown a red card in the second minute of the match for punching Lance Hahaya in the face. The reason why he got sent off the second time for the punch was he was on the ground. Wigan lost the match. He was given a 6-month ban. And Lance Hahaya literally retired the following April at the start of the following season. He made his comeback on the 16th of April. And Lance Hahaya actually wished him well on his return to play. He played 19 games. It doesn't really say much, but I know he was suspended for doping as well. But no, he definitely was made famous for what he did in the grand final in 2014. I can't believe that was 11 years ago. 11 years ago. That's mad. But no, I think it's known as one of the most notorious incidents in professional sport for violence. Yannick Sinner, Carlos Alcaraz. Well, Sinner and Alcaraz, they're the current best players in the world. Not that I follow tennis as religiously as I used to. I really don't follow it as religiously as I used to. It's another sport that I've sort of lost interest in, not because I've fallen out of love with it. I'm not as invested in tennis as I was, let's say, in the 2000s and early 2010s around the London Olympics. I'm just not as invested. There's a lot of good players out there. I think it's more competitive now in both the men's and women's at the top level in regards to winning the Grand Slams. Djokovic still making Grand Slam finals and semi-finals. He's still a top talent. He's still got the drive and the fitness and whether he's a popular figure, he's a very divisive figure. He's not my favourite cup of tea, but he's still a great competitor. There's some great young players out there. I don't think he adds to his Grand Slam total. I think he stays. Has he beaten Nadal now? Is it, or are they even on Grand Slam titles? But I don't think he adds to his Grand Slam titles. I think his era of winning is over. I reckon he'll play a couple more years at most, and that'll be it. I prefer Nadal over Djokovic. Nadal's more lovable. Federer and Nadal are far more lovable characters than Djokovic. Djokovic is like Jimmy Connors or a John McEnroe, not very likable. Whereas Federer was called the gentleman, and Nadal, there was periods when Nadal wasn't overly popular with people, but then he sort of mellowed with age. But Nadal had that youthful energy when he burst onto the scene. Andy Murray, people called him boring, but actually the injuries he played through just to win multiple Grand Slams, although nowhere near as many as I think he should have. But there are some very good champions out there. Yeah, Djokovic is one of the most. I don't think he's the most liked. And I think that pisses him off that he's not as liked as he wants to be. That I think really annoys Djokovic that not everyone likes him. He comes across as a bit of a narcissist. Just personal opinion. I'm not saying he's a nasty person. He just doesn't come across as a very likable, individual in comparison. In comparison to some of his contemporaries that he's played against and played with in the doubles as well, mixed and men's, when he's done so. When you look at his rivals and contemporaries, Stan Wawrinka wasn't well liked either. They're two champions. They're two Grand Slam champions. Multiple Grand Slam champions that I don't think were the most lovable in regards to some of their rivals. But you know, it's subjective. He has his fans and he has his critics. He's divisive. Which Ronaldo are we talking about? Are we talking about Cristiano, the arrogant, egotistical narcissist, or are we talking about Ronaldo Nazario, who I've got a bad left knee, but I'm playing on one leg, yet I won a World Cup? Because if we're talking about Ronaldo Nazario, the phenom, he's the better player. I would rather have Ronaldo Nazario over Cristiano in my team every day of the week. Every day of the week. When I was a kid, I never thought Sampras would be smashed by three people in the same generation for Grand Slam. Sampras only dominated on grass. He wasn't as good on the other surfaces. He won less. Djokovic did come from humble beginnings, ish. I wouldn't call him humble beginnings. If you've got money in the former Yugoslavia, any money, you're mafia, you're criminal, so there's no humble there. Well, Pete Sampras was another one who wasn't overly likable. He wasn't necessarily the most likable individual, but he was very successful and very driven, and was very, very good on the grass surface. And then Federer was like, hold my fondue. But no, he set a benchmark at the time. But records are there to be broken. Yes, Federer was better than Sampras on grass, absolutely. But also, you've got to remember you can't compare eras because the sports nutrition has changed, sports science, coaching, the rackets are better, the equipment's better. We know more about injury recovery and the science in regards to physio and injury management. If Pete Sampras was playing now, I think his career's longer. B, it would be very interesting to see Sampras versus Federer in a head-to-head, personally. But honestly, the sports science has changed. You've got sports analytics now that you didn't have before. So there's a lot of things. And Alcaraz and Sinner, I mean, they're forming a rivalry now, which is kind of like Connors and McEnroe a little bit. In a sense that they're both roughly the same age. They're both very young, and Sinner's a bit controversial. But look, in saying that, I mean, yeah, Sampras did retire young. I think that is interesting in itself. I think he plays longer if he's playing now. But well, because he's from the Tyrol. Technically, he's ethnically Italian, just with a German name because it's been Germanized over However, how long did Austria own the Tyrol? I know a lot of the history of the Tyrol. I'm not going to go into a history lesson, but and I've spent a lot of time in that era of Italy. It's very interesting, the history of the Alto Adige, as the Italians would call it, or the Südtirol, as the Austrians would call it. But that area of what is now Italy, north of Udine, where Bolzano is the main city, which is near where the Stelvio Pass is, which I've been up, which is a fantastic view. You've got a Swiss military fortification, and you've got the old World War One front lines with Austria on one side and Italy on the other. It's amazing. You can actually find bullet fragments and shell fragments and bits of military equipment up at the top of the Stelvio Pass if you know where to look. Yeah, he's from the Südtirol, and German, or a dialect of German, which would probably be the Tyrolese German dialect, which is really weird. When you go to the northern bit of Tyrol in Austria, which is the far west of Austria, right by the Swiss border, and the Südtirol, which is the Alto Adige in Italy, the road signs are in both languages, but then you see the place names, and then you see the old village shop, or the old beer keller, as they'll call it, the local bar. You know, the old Alpine beer keller, kind of where the locals would go with their flagons of beer and have their spicy garlic sausage and all that. The typical Bavarian style, Alpine style, you know, what we would call a pub, they would call a beer keller. It's really interesting because the spelling of the German is quite similar to Romansh in Switzerland, which is far eastern bit of Switzerland. It's a very weird language. It's like someone's got German and Italian, blurred it together, and got stoned, got drunk, done some other drugs, and tried to write. And they've just forgotten how to spell and speak, because when they speak it, they sound like they're having a stroke, and they're dribbling. And when they write it, it's weird because they use a German font, but a lot of the words look very kind of Latin. It's weird. It's weird. And Austrian German, so Österreich, Austrian German, people from Berlin or Munich, Bavaria is just across the border, they say it's like our version of country bumpkin. They're very dismissive of Austrian German. It sounds weird to them. So obviously we have all our regional accents, like the West Country or Norfolk and Suffolk, like East Anglia. We're like, you right, mate, I like that. Country accents. That's what Germans think of Austrians when they speak, with their dialect. And then you get to the Tyrol, and it's just, what the fuck are they saying? You would have Italians from Rome or Milan, or Tuscany, which is the official Italian, would go to the Alto Adige, or the Friuli region, which is where Udine is, which is the same area north of Venice, and they would not have a clue what these people are saying. Then you would have the Austrians from the Austrian side of the border go to the Alto Adige, or the Südtirol, as the Austrians would call it. Alto Adige is the Italian, the Trentino is basically the region. But they call it the Alto Adige. It's complicated. I'm going to have to go into World War One history here, and I don't want to. And I've got books on it, and it's boring. And it's not boring; it's really fun. And I've been to all the World War One battlefields that the Italians and the Austro-Hungarians fought. It's weird how they managed to hold. It's just, I'm not even going. It's just fun. But the language, the dialect they use, it's like, think of it like we've got like Scouse, we've got Geordie, we've got Mancunian, we've got West Country, we've got the Thames Valley accent, which is where I live, which is weird, really is. You've got the Brummie, you've got East Anglian, you've got, you know, Cockney or the London accents. You've got Cornish, which is no one can understand. You've got the Scottish accents as well, like Glasgow. And to basically explain what that bit of Italy and Austria is like in the Alps, it's just weird. It's weird. And if you've spent a lot of time, let's say, in a German-speaking part of the world, like Germany or Swiss German's weird as well. I'm lucky my mum can speak fluent German because with my dad based in the army out there, my mum living out there for a long time, my mum speaks fluent German and a fair bit of Italian as well. You get taught the official, this is German, this is Italian. And what it is I believe the official German as in pronounced, I think is the Prussian German, which is Berlin. The official Italian is Florence, which is Tuscan dialect, because that's where the King of Italy was in 1861 when unification was, announced. And it's you go to the regions and it's like you can tell with how they pronounce their vowels and consonants and how they pronounce words that you hear as spoken by officials, and then you learn, you've got your phrase book, you've practiced your Duolingo and all that, then you go out there and you're like, oh, you're saying something, it sounds like this, but is it? And it's just they put their own regional slang on things and regional accents. It's weird. We have the same thing here. German speakers of Brazil and Argentina. That's really funny that you mentioned Brazil and Argentina, because I've had a lot of viewers from Brazil and Argentina in the last few days. Since I did my video looking at channel growth and channel viewership over the last 3 months, suddenly, over the last few days, I've had a lot of viewers from Argentina and Brazil. Don't. But no, there's a big German and Austrian population in Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. Big, yes, very big. And a lot of them actually emigrated there before World War II, ironically. There's a lot of emigration to the Americas, plural, before World War One. A lot of emigration before World War One from all across Europe to North and South America. And for some reason, a lot of Germans went to southern Brazil, went to Argentina, went to Uruguay. A lot of them went en masse at various waves. Same with the Italians. They went in various waves before World War One, in the decades before. That's partly to do with the unification wars in Germany and Italy, partly for work. And then after World War One, there's obviously economic depression. They see these countries as opportunities to find work. There's already relatives out there, or there's big populations out there, communities out there. They go, and then World War II happens, and then some, people end up on the UN watch list and the Human Rights Court, The Hague. There was, but there's a sizable German and population, German Austrian populations in Brazil and Argentina, but there was already a lot of European emigration to the Americas in the even before the American Civil War. We're going back to the 1840s, big waves of immigration from Europe going to the Americas, predominantly more to North America at the time, but then gradually more to Central and South America from the 1840s onwards, from the non-English speaking parts of the world. A lot of Germans, a lot of Italians, a lot of Basques from northern Spain, obviously the Portuguese going to Brazil in large numbers, but a lot of Central and Eastern Europeans went in the years before and after the First World War, and then a lot went after the Second World War as well, because their homes were destroyed. They had nothing. They had what possessions they had, cobbled together what money they could, and went on the first transcontinental ocean liner, because flying was seen as, at that time, very expensive for the rich. Get on board an ocean liner, go across the Atlantic, and there already was an existing community, and there you go. There's your little history lesson. There's about 100 years worth of immigration from Europe to the Americas, in a nutshell. But it's an interesting one. It's an interesting one, how we've gone from Yannick Sinner being from that bit of Italy to Germans in South America. It's weird. We always go off on these tangents. It's fantastic. Wasn't there a big controversy in the US during World War II about the different treatment of German and Japanese immigrants? I don't know how we got onto this political historical thing. But yes, there was about 300,000 Japanese Americans interned, mostly on the West Coast in California, Oregon, Washington, and Hawaii during World War II. The anti-German sentiment didn't really, and the anti-Italian sentiment didn't really kick in because a lot of them were second and third generation immigrants who had obviously been brought up as Americans, speaking English as a first language with just a German or Italian surname, because of the waves of immigration in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s, 1890s, before the First World War. So they were second or third generation immigrants. There were some first generation immigrants that had left Italy and Germany because of the rise of fascism and Nazism, who had obviously, gone over. And if they were first generation, they were seen with a bit more suspicion because they obviously spoke English with a heavy European accent, and stuff like that. But no, German and Italian immigrants in the UK were interned straight away in the early phases of World War II. And to a certain extent in World War I as well. Germans and Austrians or Austro-Hungarian, should I say, Central Powers, Bulgarians, were interned by the Allies as well. Yes, there was on the Isle of Man, yes. Very famously on the seafront in Douglas in the Isle of Man, yes. Very famous photos. I don't know how we've got onto historical migrations of Europeans to the Americas and internment of enemy aliens under the Defence of the Realm Act 1914, but we've managed to have a history lesson. God, this is for the other channel. I keep telling you people this. Keep it sport related. But no, it's very interesting. Very interesting. And then when people say Yannick Sinner's not Italian, he's got an Italian passport. He's just from the Austrian or the German-speaking minority of the Alto Adige from the Trentino region, which used to belong to Austria until 1918. But at various points has belonged to Italian pre-unification Italian states that were controlled by the Austrian Empire, which previously was the Holy Roman Empire, where there were majority Italian speakers. But no, he's just from the German-speaking minority of ethnic Italians, because guess what? He's an ethnic Italian. He just happens to speak German because of several centuries of Austrian domination of that bit of Italy. I'm going to have to teach you guys the Italian unification process, which starts in the early, I'm going to say 1820s. Well, Kieran Foran's retirement, I'm surprised he's managed to play as long as he has with the amount of injuries he has had. Injuries have definitely, he would have played more games, a lot more games, if he wasn't dealing with a lot of injury issues and other related health issues when he was at Parramatta. Obviously, he had some mental health problems, and we shouldn't knock him for that. When he was at Parramatta, there was obviously, he did attempt to kill himself. And we're not joking about that. He did actually attempt to kill himself. The fact, he was a fantastic player. And look, obviously, after he left the Sea Eagles, he played for some pretty crap teams. let's be honest, he didn't necessarily choose the most competitive teams to play for. He's been a great servant to the game, a great servant to the Gold Coast Titans in his brief time there, but a great servant to the game in general and to New Zealand. He unfortunately had some personal issues when he was at Parramatta, and some health issues, and then the injury issues. But I think if he wasn't injured as much, he would have played more. He's one of the best players ever to wear the black of New Zealand. I think he's a great, just imagine him and Sean Johnson both being fully fit in the halves for New Zealand. Just imagine that, them both fit playing for New Zealand. That would have been ridiculous. When I hear him for and I look, it is a shame. I think injuries robbed him of potentially some of the best years of his career, but I think it's sad he's decided to call it a day, and that's him done. But at the same time, his body was broken. The fact he played as long as he has, is a testament to his willpower, his commitment. But at the end of the day, he's barely played the last couple of seasons because he's been injured. I think his body gave up on him a long time ago. The fact he just kept forcing himself to keep playing. A lot of people say he played on too long. I think, again, the injuries. This is why I don't put too much. I don't like the pressure, or should I say, that younger up-and-coming prospects are put under. In a lot of sports, it doesn't matter what the sport is. For example, when we talk about the NHL and the draft, and this player's a bust because he's struggling in his first couple of years at the senior level. I don't like the expectation and the pressure. I'm wary of it because I think it can be exceptionally damaging for the development of younger players who are trying to find their feet with established veterans on a team. They come in and they're trying to find their feet in the game. They're trying to find their way, in their careers. And they're going into a locker room where you've got established veteran players. You've got established squads where they've got their leadership core. And it's very, very hard to break through. And then you add this expectation of, this kid's going to be a superstar. And a lot of them struggle to live up to that reality and that benchmark that's set for them. They might have that one or two really good seasons, and then people are going, he's got to kick on. Well, that might be his development ceiling. He might be great in juniors because he's playing in his age grade against kids his own age. Suddenly he's now playing against veteran adults who've been playing for 5, 10, 15 years at the highest level, who, you're throwing an 18-year-old in against, men, basically. And the pace of the game is different. The physicality is another step up. The pace is another step up. And it's very hard to adjust to it. But yeah, his older brother, his career didn't kick on but as again, it's that transition from playing against people in your age grade where everyone's the same age, pretty much, give or take a year or two either way, because you've got some younger players who play a year up, and you've got some other players who might have had that injury and they're not progressing, so they might get held back a year at school or whatever it may be. So you're playing with a very narrow band of you're all roughly the same age, give or take a year. And then suddenly, at the age of 18, you get your first senior call up, and you've got veterans who are like 35 who've been doing this for 17, pushing 18 years, and there's you, first game, and you've got to try and just the pace is quicker, the physicality is quicker, and it's a shock to the system. When you've been killing it at youth level, you're the best player, and you're all this, and you're told you're going to be a superstar, and you're thrown in, and you're like, shit. that I don't think a lot of these young players are also mentally prepared for the step up, and a lot of them aren't physically ready for the step up. And then you have a lot of expectation in the media and from fans. And yeah, look, we've got social media. Look at what we're using now. We're using YouTube. We're having a discussion, and a lot of them crumble. A lot of them really struggle to find their way, and then a lot of them have issues as well. Yeah, it's always good when you have youngsters whose parents have also been pro athletes. Make their debut and follow in their father's or their mother's footsteps and go, look, I've done it. Let's hope, obviously, that he doesn't have just a handful of games and that he can kick on and you can progress. But again, there's going to be that expectation of your father played, and then there'll be that comparison depending on how well their dad played in the game. There's going to be that comparison, and that's sometimes hard to live up to how your dad did, especially if you've got let's say, for example, let's look at it. We've got some players like the Sirenans, for example. They're now both playing Super League, but they did they really have the same impact as their dad did in the NRL? That's an interesting one. That there are some players who's, the Hopoatis, for example. I mean, they're a big family that have played NRL. You've got the Travojevic brothers, all three of them. And there's, people debating which one's the best. Can you imagine if the Travojevics all have kids and their kids want to play? It's a Mitchell Pearce, his dad Wayne Pearce. I don't. There's that expectation, but because your father played, you've got to live up to an expectation and it's difficult, and I think Nathan Cleary has definitely exceeded his dad's career. I think Nathan Cleary is the better player there. But yeah, there was that expectation, there was that pressure put upon him to reach a level, and there was some concerns that with what happened with Mitchell Pearce, with a lot of expectation and pressure put upon Mitchell Pearce at state of origin and at club level, where don't get me wrong, Mitchell Pearce was a damn good player, but the media liked going after him after he had a bad game or the team had a bad performance. And then he had his off-field issues, which definitely was an issue for him. And there was a concern that Nathan Cleary would not fulfill his potential because of who his dad was. It's the same with Maverick Gaia, with obviously his dad being a club legend. It hasn't worked for Maverick Gaia, which is a shame. And it looks like Maverick Gaia's probably played his last game as a Penrith Panther, and he's going to end up somewhere else. His younger brother, Jet. Yeah, his younger brother is obviously at the Warriors. Ivan Cleary coached at the Warriors, which is one of the reasons why he's gone through the Warriors system. I think that's deliberately done as well by the Cleary family, which I think is a good move. He can develop his own game away from his brother and his dad, which I think is important. And reports coming out of New Zealand is he's quite the player, potentially better than Nathan Cleary, which would be ridiculous if he's actually the better of the two brothers. It'll be interesting to see if and when he makes his debut for the Warriors. And there are some people suggesting that he's potentially got a higher ceiling than Nathan Cleary, which would be ridiculous. Yeah, I think there's less pressure on him in New Zealand with the Warriors, although with how the Warriors have done in recent seasons and with the fan engagement, and the positivity around the Warriors and how they've got a bit of a growing fan base. I think as time goes on, I think potentially more pressure will come his way. And if the Warriors go on a run in the final series, that changes things. And obviously, last year was a big drop off and it was a blip. And with injuries this year, they've still made the top 8. Admittedly, they slipped back from the top 4 a little bit. And I do think injuries have started to take their toll. But the Warriors have had another good season. 2 out of 3 seasons making the top 8. They're starting to show more consistency. The fan base is fantastic. I do, in my opinion, believe that the 20th team should be based in New Zealand. You build a natural rivalry with the Warriors, and it's very clear and very obvious that New Zealand can support 2 NRL franchises. So that's my view on whether New Zealand deserves a second team. Yes, it does. But I do think, yes, Jet Cleary staying with the Warriors organisation rather than going through the Panthers organisation, I think Ivan has been very, very clever there in making sure that, the spotlight's off him a little bit. The media circus is not following him around, and he can develop at his pace. And as I say, reports are suggesting that at the same age he's doing better than Nathan Cleary was, and that he potentially, with how he's developing, has a higher ceiling as a player, which would be fantastic. Can you just imagine him playing? Can you imagine a head-to-head where the 2 Cleary brothers are playing head-to-head and Jet Cleary outdoes his brother? That'd be the rugby league media would have a meltdown. It would explode. Be very interesting. Very interesting. With some of the negative headlines we've seen in the last few years involving players and media personalities and agents, it's kind of nice to see that some of these young players are developing and learning the game, and then some more senior players like a Kieran Foran has decided now, and Mark Nichols as well for the Dolphins, and both Bromwich brothers have now retired. That some of the more veteran players that have given a lot to the game have decided now we're going to call it a day, and that's put the queue in the rack. Oh yeah. I mean, Mark Nichols, very underrated servant to the game. Jesse Bromwich, Kenny Bromwich. I think what they've done for the game as well. They both Bromwich brothers are now retired. I think Kieran Foran, I think, look, as I say, if injuries hadn't robbed him of some of his best years, I think he would still be playing and potentially could have. I mean, how many games has Kieran Foran lost because of injury, where he's been unavailable? Can you just count them up, and then you could say he could have potentially played and maybe beaten Cameron Smith's appearance record if it wasn't for injury? If he'd stayed fit throughout his entire career, didn't have his mental health issues when he was at Parramatta in about 2016, can you imagine if Kieran Foran had been fit the entire time? It'd be ridiculous. And I'll say it again. Just imagine a fully fit Kieran Foran and a fully fit Sean Johnson in the halves for New Zealand when they're both fully fit at the same time. Be ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. There is no doubt that Kieran Foran was I think he's underrated as a player. I do think he's criminally underrated as a player. I think that combination he formed with Cherry Evans at the Sea Eagles. I don't think the Sea Eagles have had a combination like that since, where someone's complimented Cherry Evans. It just hasn't worked. And Kieran Foran, wherever he's gone, he's given 110%. He's played through injury. He's battled on. He's been a veteran presence around younger players, giving them advice and encouragement and guiding them around. But as I say, injuries have really, I think, robbed him of potentially a longer career and a better career. But I think he was a brilliant player. On his day, fantastic 5'8", halfback, depending on which position you want to play. He's even played hooker as well. He can play 3 out of the 4 spine positions and do so really well. He's got a good short kicking game. Great, reads the game very well. And we're not going to see Kieran Foran play anymore. It's a shame. This is where he comes out of retirement for New Zealand for the Pacific Tests and then retires. Does a Sean Johnson, comes out to help the New Zealand team win. But no, he's had a great career. He's in my opinion a criminally underrated player. And I think would have, as I say, Sean Johnson, Kieran Foran both fully fit in the halves of New Zealand. That's just potentially one of the best halves combinations we could have ever seen. Talking about New Zealand, we haven't mentioned Brandon Smith and his charges. The Brandon Smith charges, I mean, look, it's gone a bit quiet on the reporting front. He's got caught, I think, in 10 days' time? I think it's September the 18th. He appears in court. This has the potential to not only Brandon Smith's career is on the line, but it has the potential to cause a lot of problems for the Roosters and any other players that he knows that could be brought into this scandal, because it has been reported he's borrowed money off current and former teammates and other players in the game that he's friends with, and that there's a gambling issue there. And there's also drugs at play. Now, it's a messy situation. It's a situation I think the NRL would rather hadn't happened, and it's bad headlines for the NRL. Very bad headlines. It's not a good look. We'll have to see what happens when the court convenes and he has his court date. But I find it interesting as well that the Rabbitohs didn't stand him down. The NRL didn't stand him down. It'll be interesting to see the fact that the police charged him and gave him a bench charge or something. I don't know how the Queensland legal system works in difference to the legal system here, but I find it very interesting that yet again we're having a scandal in the NRL where there's alleged drug use. There's basically players misbehaving, and there's a lot of people in social media saying the NRL needs to get tougher with the drugs testing, with the drug use policy, and try to clean up the culture of the sport. Throughout this channel's existence since 2017, there has been no shortage of players alleged to have used or caught using recreational drugs that are on the banned list. And we can debate the pros and cons of narcotic legislation and the World Anti-Doping Agency's stance on it and what's on the banned list and what's not. And, decriminalisation and legalisation and everything like that, which is an interesting debate to have. But pretty much every year without fail, pretty much for the most part, there is at least one drug incident where a player or players are alleged or caught using or in possession of illegal drugs. Mostly cocaine, but we've also heard rumours of abuse of amphetamines and cannabis, and people's debate over the use of medicinal cannabis, and some legislation it's legal in some areas, and some it does not matter. We are regularly, since 2017, it is on with regularity, just frequent regularity, that players are misbehaving and doing it in a way which is very bad on the optics and very bad in regards to the image, and we've seen it in the AFL as well. And rumours and allegations go back decades in regards to drug misuse with players, recreational drug use of players. And obviously last year we saw the AFL embroiled in the drug scandal, where they were, with their drugs policy and was it fit for purpose, and the public image and the public perception of the whole situation. And I think the NRL, or rugby league in general, but the NRL in this instance has a problem as well with player behaviour and the use of recreational drugs and gambling, and it's like the 2017, 2018 kind of that off season and all the antics that went on then, and all the allegations made against players back then when Todd Greenberg was the NRL CEO. I don't think the behaviour has changed much. I really don't. And rugby league has the habit of shooting itself in the foot. And at some point, we've got to ask the question, at some point, the sport's got to clean up its act. The players, not all of them, there's a huge proportion of players that, are sensible, respectful, decent human beings. And then there are others who damage the reputation of the sport by their antics, their actions, and unfortunately, too many people give them a pass. They're called characters and larrikins, and they're given a pass for basically being pretty thick, pretty stupid, and putting themselves in positions they shouldn't be putting themselves in. And we can debate whether they should be role models for society and young people. But some of them actually are role models within their community because of the Indigenous aspect, with the issues that the Indigenous Aboriginal population in Australia face with drug and alcohol misuse and drug and alcohol related crime. And, and then they do dumb shit. I'm not even, I have no sympathy when they get caught, because unfortunately it's just a bad look. It's a real bad look. And as I say, we can have the debate around, narcotics legislation and whether it's, we should decriminalise and regulate and legalise or whatever it may be. But I do think, Brandon Smith hasn't helped himself. There's no smoke without fire. I think he's got himself in a very tricky situation. I think he's definitely got a gambling problem. That's well known. This is not the first time he's been alleged to have been involved in recreational drug use. And there's a lot to this that I think will come out in court when the court appearance is had, and it's all on the public record. And then we'll see what happens, because if it doesn't go his way, and he's prosecuted, he's looking up to 3 years in prison if he's found guilty. And that then is a completely different conversation we're having. His career is on the line, and while many in the media and on the podcast scene, like James Graham and Paul Kent, at least Paul Kent did talk about it in brief passing. But I am disappointed in James Graham not bringing it up on his podcast and just saying, look, Brandon Smith, these are allegations against him. It's in the news. I think that's very poor form by a lot of the rugby league podcasters. It's like they're brushing it under the carpet because it's sort of seen as acceptable within rugby league that drug misuse, be it, cocaine or speed, is ecstasy or whatever they're doing. It's the lads being lads. It's only got to take one of them to overdose, have a heart attack, and then suddenly the debate changes. We saw the AFL try and basically catch Ben Cousins. He never failed a drugs test. It was known, however, that he was doing almost every drug under the sun, from cannabis through to basically crystal meth, if not heroin. He's had multiple stints in and out of prison for a variety of, including domestic violence. But the AFL could not catch him on the tests. They tried to deregister him. He made a comeback. Obviously, his history is out there. But even the AFL has been grappling with this for 30 years. And neither league, I think, has dealt with the issue. And, we've done multiple videos on this channel when rugby league players have failed drugs tests, rugby union players failing drugs tests, football players, multiple athletes getting caught with recreational drugs in their system. They still don't learn. But it's going to take a high-profile player to overdose, collapse on the field of play, and then it comes out they've got drugs in their system for change to happen. Because I swear it's like a naughty known secret within professional sport that this goes on, and it's sort of like it's the boys being boys. And even in women's sport as well. It's part of the culture. Yeah, I think unfortunately, I won't say it's an accepted secret, but it's sort of like it happens. I think it's just, unfortunately, I think there's enough players that if they were to test everyone, there's a huge proportion of the player base who are suspended. And I think the leagues around the world in a variety of sports know that they can't test everyone because they would be suspending too many players. The reason why those individual players like Zach Hardacre got caught, for example, in rugby league when he was playing for Castleford, and I think it was John Hardy for Scotland in rugby union, was the doping tests the testers were actually in. It wasn't the leagues, testing them. It was the independent testers testing them, the anti-doping, and they were off their tits. I think there was one weekend in the Super League where 3 players at 2 separate matches tested positive for cocaine on the same day. And of course, you had the Kevin Proctor and Bromwich and Sean Kenny Dow on the Anzac Test weekend back in the day, in the same year. You had the Cameron Munster and Brandon Smith incident in 2021. There's been a few others as well. The Reece Walsh outside the nightclub when he was told to fuck off home by the police, refused to leave. They nicked him. They found drugs on him. And then he suddenly leaves the Warriors for personal reasons to go back to Brisbane, even though he signed a 3-year contract extension. I think the Brisbane Broncos were like, yeah, he's screwed up on their watch, and then he gave them the finger and went back to Brisbane. I think if the NRL was to get really serious, they would have a PR nightmare with how many players they would have to suspend for a minimum of 2 to 4 years. They would be. I think the PR nightmare they would face, which is why they don't test the players as often as I think they should. It's random testing. It's done twice a season. Players know they can get away with it. It's well known in the NHL, for example, you get tested twice in the season, once in the pre-season and generally once around Christmas, normally before the winter break or the All-Star break. You get tested twice. And it is known that drug use happens. It's a known fact, and it's been going on since the 80s, at potentially earlier 70s at the earliest. Definitely by the 80s onwards, there's been drug use. Players know. They know they're tested randomly, and they know it happens 2, maybe 4 times a year, and they realise they're less likely to get caught because it's not every weekend, because it costs too much money. And that's another reason why the NRL doesn't do it. It costs too much money. But a lot of leagues, it's a known fact. The tests are infrequent and random. The players that have got caught have been caught because of inside knowledge, and it's a deliberately targeted test. That's how they catch people. For the most part, it's random, and that is part of the problem. They're not. It's the cost of testing. I think Zach Hardacre and the other players that were caught in the Super League in 2017, I believe they were targeted tests from what I can gather from what happened at the time and reporting and the information around that time. I believe they were targeted tests in hindsight. But Zach Hardacre is one of those players with a lot of off-field dramas, and I don't have a lot of sympathy for him, for him constantly getting into trouble with the law. He's a very dislikable, and people go, "Oh, he's got ADHD," and I've got ADHD. I don't racially assault a taxi driver or homophobically abuse another player or drink drive, crash my car and try and flee the scene, not once but twice. There to me, that's a cop out. It's lazy. It's a cop out. Clearly, he's been given multiple opportunities as an elite player in the Super League and in the NRL, and how many chances do you need to give someone before they're banned again? But it's a known fact. I mean, you look at Diego Maradona and Paul Gascoigne in the 80s and 90s, and it was very clear and very obvious that there was a drug use problem. And it wasn't just them. Carlo Canigia, obviously a contemporary of Maradona with Argentina in the 90s, it was well known in the 70s onwards that recreational drug use was a thing in professional sport. And it's still a thing now. There's always reports coming out of allegations of players, active players, abusing recreational drugs. It is known. in a lot of sports, and occasionally players get caught. Um, but yeah, I mean, if they were to properly test all the players every weekend, you would have, I would say, 20 to 40%, maybe as high as 60%, would be banned. I always say this about my workplace. If they were to do the drug and alcohol test properly, 60 to 70% would fail, and that's even with just having a couple of beers the night before, because you've still got a blood alcohol level that's above what is acceptable. You would fail, and unfortunately, I think that's what needs to happen. Unfortunately, it's the cost, and that's why sports don't do it. And then it would be the potential for the PR nightmare when they've got to suspend a lot of players. It's like the Bath Rugby Union scandal with Matt Stevens as the fall guy, but a lot of players were basically alleged. Well, it was true, but a lot of other players, it was alleged that it was widespread drug use. And Matt Stevens, unfortunately, was the guy that got thrown on the bus because he was the up and coming England Test player at the time, and he was the one that got thrown under the bus for a culture issue at that club. I think, Grant Fuhr in the NHL was really thrown under the bus. To a certain extent, Bob Probert was as well. But with Probert, the police got involved. But Grant Fuhr was thrown under the bus by the NHL. And a lot of people said there was racism with that as well, because he was obviously mixed race. But they were the two players thrown under the bus for the wider sporting cultural problems that the NHL had in the 80s and 90s with drug use. And it was a well-known secret. It wasn't really a secret, but it was well known. And the rumour, there's no smoke without fire, that it wasn't just the Edmonton Oilers and the Detroit Red Wings. The Washington Capitals were known to be party animals in the 80s and 90s. It was just well known that basically every NHL team at the time, it was well known. And the league did not test the players because they knew a lot of their superstars would have to suspend them. So they just cherry picked two of the players who were high profile in Grant Fuhr and Bob Probert. In my personal opinion, although Probert, obviously with the police involvement, that obviously is a bit more difficult, but Grant Fuhr, and Probert as well, and they threw them under the bus. And there's still a lot of bitterness about that today. And at the end of the day, that was over 30 years ago, but I think it's still relevant today. There's still a lot of bitterness from some within the game of how the late Bob Probert and Grant Fuhr were treated by the NHL, when in reality every team had this cultural issue. Whether it still exists now, I probably does, but not in the levels that it did 20, 30, 40 years ago. But yeah, there's still some anger at how that was dealt with. And it's interesting how we've gone from, talking about, the sack. I mean, what did I start? I mean, we obviously we've had Eric Ten Hag sacked by Bayer Leverkusen, and a lot of other stuff's happened as well. We were talking about the Women's Rugby World Cup and how it's been a great tournament and things like that. And we've ended up on recreational drug use in sports, but I mean, crikey, I think even Andre Agassi in tennis, it's a thing. And I do think a lot of these pro sports realise that if they were to test all their athletes, they would have a big problem. And it'd be a very embarrassing problem. And then, for example, you lose the family fan base. So the respectable audience. You then potentially lose sponsors. TV deals get impacted because, let's say, some of your superstar players are suspended, and it becomes a very, very nasty crisis. And this is where I think the NRL were at in 2018. And this is where the AFL was at with Ben Cousins in the 2000s. They had a problem, and it was isolated incidents, but they were like, it's a recurring theme. We need to do something. We need to make an example out of someone. And I do think if Brandon Smith is found guilty, I actually think the NRL are forced to take serious action where they deregister him. But we now know that Victor Radley, his name's now been brought into the conversation. This has the potential to really blow up the Sydney Roosters because apparently there's 7 players involved. It'd be interesting to see what other players at other clubs get dragged into this, because apparently Brandon Smith borrowed money not only off teammates but also other players in the game. And it'll be interesting to see what other players are dragged into this, and whether they also, in regards to Brandon Smith borrowing money, are also in what their involvement is, and it has the potential to be a really big, damaging scandal for the NRL. And we'll just have to see how it all plays out. Anyway, I've been rambling now for over 2 hours. I really appreciate the comments. Some very interesting questions raised. And yeah, it's been a very interesting. Well, since the last live stream, a lot's happened. Obviously, we've had the Morecambe situation. Sheffield Wednesday is going to be interesting to see what happens with Sheffield Wednesday. And we will keep an eye on the Sheffield Wednesday situation. And of course, Eric Ten Hag's got the sack, but I think some more managers end up getting the sack before Christmas. I would say even potentially before the end of the month, we could see more managers get the sack, and then we're having the debate about the managerial circus that is, and how that keeps a revolving door of managers coming and going and getting sacked, which I think is also damaging for football and player development, and it adds to the financial burden that we have with clubs, because they've got to pay compensation payments to managers because they've obviously terminated their contract. They've got to pay them out under contract law. So there's that. But I'm going to call that a stream. Thank you very much for all the questions. Really appreciate it. And there'll be more content throughout the week because I've got a week off work, so I can do a bit more channel-focused stuff. And yeah, from me for now, it is goodbye. And I'll have some more content for you all very, very soon. So it's bye for now.